And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much.
The atmosphere inside the historical residence of Clarence House turned ice cold within a split second as the heavy wooden doors closed behind the messengers. King Charles stood motionless near the grand fireplace, clutching a document that felt heavier than the crown he wore on his head. The legal proclamation in his trembling hands did not just signal a standard bureaucratic adjustment. It marked a profound shift in the invisible balance of power that had governed the royal family for centuries. The highest court had officially intervened in a private dynastic dispute, granting Princess an absolute, exclusive, and unappealable control over the sacred royal vaults. In that single, breathtaking moment, the reigning sovereign was forced to confront a reality he never anticipated. The most guarded secrets, historical letters, private diaries, and ancestral artifact of the House of Windsor were now officially beyond his imperial reach. The realization hit him not as a political challenge, but as a devastating personal wound that deeply fractured his confidence. Across the room, Princess stood with an unyielding posture, her face a mask of disciplined restraint that had been perfected through decades of silent service to the crown. She did not display a hint of triumph, nor did her eyes flash with a thrill of victory. Instead, her countenance reflected the heavy, solemn burden of a protector who had been chosen to shield a family's ultimate legacy from the unpredictable emotional currents of the modern era. Charles read the final paragraph of the judicial decree once, then twice, hoping that the formal language might somehow shift if he stared at it long enough in the heavy silence of the chamber. But the ink remained dry, stubborn, and absolute. The institutional instinct that the sitting monarch must always hold the final key to every hidden room in the palace had been decisively shattered before his very eyes. The king slowly lowered the parchment onto the polished mahogany desk, unable to find the words to express the mixture of grief and betrayal that was swelling within his chest, and watched him process the immense blow, recognizing that her brother's torment was not merely about physical access to locked chambers, but about the profound emotional weight of memory, parental trust, and the painful realization that their late mother's ultimate confidence had been deliberately directed away from the throne. Beneath the rigid, complex legal terminology of the court order lay an even colder, more systemic truth that the palace could no longer ignore. The royal vaults had never actually been designed to serve the personal whims or immediate desires of whoever happened to wear the crown. Instead, they had always been legally tied to a specially designated, named custodian through a highly confidential royal trust arrangement, an ancient constitutional safeguard explicitly created to protect the raw, unvarnished history of the monarchy from temporary pressures, personal vanities, and public curiosity. Charles stiffened as his eyes caught that specific clause, his mind racing back to the private conversations he had shared with his mother in her final days. It was at this moment that a highly classified, sealed memorandum, written in the late Queen Elizabeth's unmistakable hand and attached to her final household directives, emerged as the unstoppable legal force that determined the court's dramatic judgment. A memorandum of this nature is the most definitive, binding instruction a monarch can leave behind, intended to dictate exactly how the most sensitive and potentially scandalous family possessions must be policed. When Charles finally raised his heavy eyes to ask who else among the senior courtiers had reviewed the document and remained perfectly silent, that deliberate, unyielding silence caused more emotional damage than any open accusation ever could, because it loudly signaled that the ruling was not just about administrative organization. It was fundamentally about institutional confidence. It explained with brutal clarity why the late queen had chosen her daughter to stand as an immovable wall, knowing that even a king might eventually bend when subjected to intense domestic pressure or external persuasion. Long before the rest of the household could even begin to comprehend the massive implications of the decree, a whisper of profound unease began traveling from room to the private corridors of Buckingham Palace. The question that haunted every senior advisor in royal aid was as simple as it was devastating. Why had the late queen chosen, and over her own son, the king? For Charles, the legal judgment felt like an open wound dressed up in formal judicial prose, an explicit statement that his authority as head of state did not automatically make him the guardian of the family's private soul. For Anne, the appointment was an exhausting duty she never sought but would never abandon, an extension of a lifetime defined by absolute discipline, quiet efficiency, and a refusal to ever turn royal privilege into a public spectacle. The crown belonged to Charles by the undeniable right of succession, But this historic decision made it abundantly clear that there were sacred spaces within the monarchy that even a king could not enter by mere right of his title. This was precisely what made the emotional impact so sharp and enduring. The vault ruling did not challenge Charles's right to govern, his public speeches, or his ceremonial duties. Yet it separated sovereign power from private family stewardship with surgical, devastating precision. The royal vaults were no longer an asset the king could manage as part of his daily routine. They had become a heavily fortified fortress guarded by his sister, creating a barrier that cut deeper than any modern media criticism ever could, and understood the deep sorrow her brother was experiencing. But she also fully understood why their mother had chosen absolute caution over personal comfort. Her entire life had been anchored in the philosophy of royal restraint. She had fulfilled thousands of engagements without ever demanding public applause, carried the heaviest loads without converting her duty into a theatrical performance, and protected the most delicate family matters with a fierce silence that generations of courtiers had learned to fear and respect. Therefore, the shocking court ruling did not surprise everyone within the palace walls equally. While some members of the immediate household viewed the decision as an unnecessarily harsh blow to a new king trying to establish his reign, others recognized the profound, undeniable logic behind the Queen's final act. The late monarch had placed the keys in the hands of the one person alive who was entirely immune to the temptations of modern glamour, emotional manipulation, or marital persuasion. When Charles later spoke to Prince William in the strict privacy of his study, his voice carried the hollow ache of a grieving son rather than the commanding authority of a ruler. He confessed to the Prince of Wales that it felt as though his mother had spoken directly from beyond the grave, deliberately choosing to place a check on his personal power. William did not offer a rushed response to comfort his father. He stood in contemplative silence, fully aware that this crisis was not merely a disagreement between siblings. It was a stark, lonely reminder that the crown resting upon Charles's head did not possess the power to erase or rewrite the final, enduring judgments left behind by the legendary woman who had worn it for 70 years before him. Meanwhile, and sat completely alone in her private quarters later that evening, her leather gloves folded neatly in her lap as she stared out into the dark palace gardens. To the public world, the Princess Royal appeared as steady, unbreakable, and resolute as ever, but the true weight of the court's mandate had begun to press heavily upon her shoulders. Accepting total control of the vaults meant that she had to be prepared to stand directly against her own brother, the king, whenever her solemn duty to the late Queen demanded it. She knew with absolute certainty that the first permanent emotional fracture within the family had already opened up, because Queen Camilla's name was completely, noticeably absent from the official access list attached to the judicial decree. This quiet, deliberate omission sent a wave of intense tension through the entire royal household before a single word could even be spoken aloud. Furthermore, William had noticed another crucial detail within the dense legal paperwork. Princess Catherine's name appeared under a highly protected, exclusive ceremonial category, strongly hinting that certain historic jewels, personal tiaras, and sacred heirlooms had already been legally reserved and locked away specifically for the future queen. This crucial discovery completely altered the atmosphere within the family meetings, injecting a sense of future certainty that bypassed the current reign. When a senior royal archivist casually mentioned an older, unresolved dispute connected to a past Windsor ceremony, an expression shifted instantly, as if a deeply buried, painful memory had suddenly rushed back to the surface with unstoppable force. The deeper the senior family members looked into the roots of this judicial crisis, the clearer it became that this earth-shattering judgment had not simply materialized out of nowhere. It was a direct, inevitable consequence of a massive royal rupture that had taken place behind closed doors months prior, a moment where private entitlement had directly clashed with institutional duty, leaving a trail of paperwork that could never be erased. The roots of this unprecedented family division traces directly back to a cold afternoon following Queen Elizabeth's final memorial service at Windsor, a moment where the invisible boundaries of palace authority were tested for the very first time in complete secrecy. While the nation was still buried in profound mourning, a quiet request had emerged from Queen Camilla's household that bypassed the established order of royal consultation. Her aides had formally requested immediate access to a restricted tray of historic family jewels held deep within the Windsor vaults, executing the move before Princess, and had even been officially notified of the administrative entry. and had not forgotten that specific day because it represented the exact type of entitlement and overreach that their late mother had spent her final years worrying about. The memorial service had already left the immediate family emotionally raw, and everyone within the palace walls was moving with extreme caution around issues of grief, rank, and historical memory. A vault inspection, in its simplest terms, was never supposed to be an exhibition of power. It was a highly precise, quiet, and deeply respectful inventory check of sacred objects kept under strict family restriction. Yet, Camilla's household had treated the request as a mere routine ceremonial matter, assuming that a collection of historic diamonds could be withdrawn through standard administrative channels simply by right of the new queen consort's position. Camilla herself may not have spoken the words directly to the guards, but her household staff carried her absolute authority, and that dynamic made the intrusion highly dangerous for the internal stability of the monarchy. The queen consort's new status gave the demand immense institutional weight, while Anne's complete absence from the authorization process made the event feel like a deliberate, silent test of the new palace hierarchy. King Charles understood the gravity of the situation immediately when the alert reached his desk, knowing that the family's emotional state was far too fragile to handle an internal conflict over material inheritance. He knew that every single piece of jewelry connected to the late monarch carried far more than material value. It carried the living memory of a 7-year reign and the personal blessings of a mother. He also recognized that if this initial request passed through the gates without a firm challenge, the private order consultation his mother had quietly established to protect the family's integrity would be permanently weakened, and arrive at the vault registry office before the head archivist could officially settle the matter or hand over the keys to the waiting aides. The official register, a heavily guarded leather book documenting exactly who requested access and for what specific purpose, was already lying open on the table. She looked at the blank lines, understood the true intent behind the request, and closed the heavy book with one single, firm motion before another name could be inscribed on the page. That solitary, silent act completely altered the temperature of the room. No shouting was necessary. No dramatic accusations had to be made, and no tempers were lost. The Princess Royal had simply drawn a movable line in the sand, and everyone present felt the absolute force of her authority. Charles stepped into the corridor moments later, caught in an agonizing position between his protective instinct for his wife and his absolute obedience to the order his mother had left behind. He quietly asked and to let this one request pass, arguing that a single concession was a small price to pay for the sake of domestic peace during a time of national transition. But, and answered his plea with the kind of absolute quiet that hurts far more than open anger, telling him that certain institutional boundaries become completely meaningless the very first time they are ignored by those in power. Charles heard the deep warning in her voice, and Camilla felt the direct consequence of the refusal. Because the barrier Anne had raised was not aimed at preventing a public ceremony, it was aimed directly at curbing a sense of unearned entitlement. A senior vault officer later recorded the entire incident in a highly protected, confidential note, a private written account kept completely away from ordinary household files to ensure that a permanent paper trail existed. Then, the late Queen's private memorandum emerged from the legal archives, revealing to the executors why Anne had acted with such swift, calculated precision. The document explicitly anticipated exactly this type of familial breach and named her as the sole individual legally empowered to stop it. What had begun as a quiet, tense disagreement in a dim palace corridor quickly became the spark for a major legal confrontation that would force Charles and into a direct, unavoidable collision. By the time the final court ruling arrived months later, the emotional wound was already old, but the confrontation it created behind closed doors was painfully fresh. The ultimate meeting did not take place before cameras, politicians, or public crowds. It happened behind the heavy, soundproof doors of a private palace room where a king and his sister faced each other not as historical symbols, but as siblings carrying decades of shared grief, disappointment, and fierce pride. Charles wanted an immediate explanation for why his sister had allowed the matter to go to court, while and wanted an unconditional acceptance of the rules their mother had left behind. Between them lay a binding judicial decree that neither of them possessed the power to undo or alter. Charles had summoned Anne to his study because the prolonged silence between their households had become completely unbearable. The news of the court's decision had already moved through the palace like a cold draft, touching every room every senior advisor, and every private conversation among the staff. He could easily endure public criticism. He could survive negative front-page headlines, and he could manage political pressure, but he could not endure the agonizing thought that his own sister had accepted legal authority over the family vaults without first trying to spare him the public humiliation. For the king, the dispute was no longer just a constitutional matter. It had become deeply personal, because the court had placed the most intimate symbols of his family's history entirely beyond his imperial command, and entered the study knowing full well that the conversation could permanently damage their relationship if either of them lost control. She knew that if she softened her position even slightly, Charles might mistake her kindness for uncertainty. But if she stood too firm, he would remember the conversation as an act of calculated cruelty. That was a cruel trap the judicial ruling had created within the family dynamic. It had turned necessary duty into an act of defiance and absolute obedience into a deep personal betrayal. The Princess Royal had spent an entire lifetime doing the difficult, unglamorous tasks that other members of the family actively avoided. But this situation was fundamentally different. This time, her legendary discipline did not protect her from the emotional fallout. It placed her directly in front of her brother's pain. Charles stood rigidly by the fireplace and asked a single question that had been burning inside his mind since the document arrived, asking if and truly believed that he could not be trusted to honor their mother's historical legacy. The word legacy carried the immense weight of everything that had been left unsaid since the funeral. Their mother's private letters, her personal diaries, her secret instructions, and her final judgment on the character of the family, and did not rush to answer his question because she knew that a single defensive word would instantly turn his deep grief into explosive anger. She looked at him calmly and stated that trust had never been the core question. The real issue was discipline. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly after that statement, and Charles absorbed the distinction with visible difficulty, and had not accused him of personal weakness or moral failure. She had simply named the ever-present danger of domestic pressure, marital persuasion, and emotional manipulation inside a family structure built entirely around rank and status. A custodian, in plain language, is a person who is legally trusted to protect an asset for the benefit of future generations, not someone who possesses it for their own personal vanity, and revealed to her brother that the late queen had left highly specific, non-negotiable instructions requiring a separate custodian whenever vault access became personally or politically sensitive. The late monarch had not wanted an ongoing family debate. She had wanted an absolute wall. Charles then learned the hardest, most humiliating part of the entire judicial framework. The court order did not merely empower, and it legally prevented him from overruling her decisions on vault matters without undergoing a formal public review process. This meant that even the sitting king had to step outside his royal instinct and follow a strict, binding procedure managed by his sister, and held the document with absolute calm, but the institutional power contained within its pages was devastating. Charles turned his back to her, and in that heavy moment of silence, he finally understood the brutal truth of his new reign. The real power over the family's soul was not resting in the grand title he carried, but in the private instructions she was now legally bound to guard. The shifting balance of power within the monarchy did not remain hidden behind palace doors for long, as the invisible machinery that sustained Princess Anne's legal authority quickly generated waves across the entire administrative network of the realm. Charles had initially believed that his intense, emotional confrontation with his sister represented the absolute peak of the crisis, but the technical reality operating behind her newly confirmed title proved to be even colder and more immovable than he could have ever anticipated. The court order was not built on temporary family emotions or personal reactions. It was firmly anchored in a highly secure, private custodial framework that explicitly separated control of the royal vaults from the ordinary, day-to-day decisions of the royal household. In practical terms, this structural separation meant that the vaults could no longer be treated as spaces the king could easily manage or reconfigure through routine sovereign instructions. They were treated as heavily protected dynastic property governed by rules far older than the current reign itself. Senior trustees, royal archivists, and constitutional legal officers moved through the technical transition with quiet, devastating certainty that offered no room for negotiation or compromise. Trustees are individuals legally appointed to defend specific assets on behalf of a trust, and in this tense scenario, they officially confirmed the king's deepest institutional fears. The vaults contained deeply personal dynastic property. meaning intimate family heirlooms explicitly tied to the private bloodline of the Windsor family rather than assets belonging to the public, state-owned crown. Archivists, whose entire professional existence is dedicated to preserving historical records and proving the truth through authentic documents, trace the lineage of the specific authority back through decades of private royal agreements, while legal officers seamlessly connected those ancient records to the late Queen Elizabeth's final written directives. Every technical explanation and legal clarification provided by the experts only served to make Anne's position stronger, safer, and completely untouchable. A senior courtier who was secretly watching Charles review the newly updated access chart later noted the exact fraction of a second when the king's face hardened into a mask of pure frustration. The formal chart did not openly insult the sovereign. It did something far more agonizing by systematically organizing him into a fixed structure. His grand authority appeared clearly beneath Anne's final line of approval, not above it, sending an unmistakable institutional message that he could easily request access, he could formally advise, and he could raise theoretical questions, but he no longer possessed the legal power to simply command the doors to open. This operational difference struck the king with brutal force because the entire concept of monarchy depends heavily on powerful symbols of absolute authority, and this specific layout displayed a permanent restriction placed directly over the sovereign will. Anne felt a heavy emotional weight from the opposite side of the desk as she signed the very first post-ruling vault directive with visible, profound reluctance. She did not hesitate because she doubted the ultimate correctness of the order, but because she knew with absolute certainty that every single stroke of her pen would be interpreted by the family as a direct challenge to her brother's crown. The directive immediately froze all non-essential access requests, including several traditional ceremonial withdrawals that had historically passed through the king's private office without a single moment of friction. A directive, in its purest sense, is a binding administrative instruction that dictates exactly what officials must execute, and this particular document altered the entire operational rhythm of the palace within a single morning. Then came the micro-detail within the text that sharpened the conflict even further. A highly restricted inventory page explicitly referenced a unique category known as the Queen's Reserve, a protected group of historical items completely shielded from household politics years before the current crisis even began. This meant that the late monarch had not reacted suddenly out of anger. She had prepared for this exact scenario with calculated, cold foresight. When Camilla learned through her staff that one of her highly anticipated ceremonial requests had been officially suspended under the authority of Anne's new directive, the hidden power struggle within the family finally burst into open view. The legal language of the court may have been dry, but its practical consequences arrived in human form, and they arrived directly at the Queen Consort's door. The fallout did not begin with dramatic shouting matches along the corridors, but with a quiet, systematic administrative refusal. A standard request had moved through the palace system exactly as it always had for decades, fully expecting the routine approval, the comfortable habit, and the traditional rhythm of royal privilege that usually accompanied the crown. Then, it simply stopped moving. For Camilla, the administrative message was impossible to mistake. A historical door that had once opened effortlessly through her husband's authority now required her sister's explicit permission and had calmly chosen not to turn the iron key. Camilla's household staff had submitted the request with immense confidence because old habits disappear very slowly inside an ancient institution, intending to secure a specific historic piece for a major upcoming ceremonial appearance, where every single detail of clothing and jewelry is analyzed by the public to project status and power. A ceremonial appearance is an official event where a royal figure represents the continuity of the monarchy before the nation, and under the new rules, the path of least resistance had completely disappeared. The request was explicitly redirected away from the king's inner office and placed directly onto the desk of the custodian, now legally responsible for the vaults, forcing the family to realize that they were no longer dealing with simple palace courtesy, but with a rigid constitutional rule that would not bend for a marriage certificate, a grand title, or proximity to the throne. When the official refusal notice arrived, the Queen Consort read the document in complete, heavy silence, placing the paper face down on a side table while her personal aides waited in tense anticipation. That small, quiet pause carried far more deep-seated anger than any raised voice ever could, because the refusal had not merely denied access to a diamond. It had exposed a stark new reality within the family dynamics. Charles entered the room moments later and saw the document before she could even speak, understanding instantly that his inability to intervene had officially crossed from an institutional discomfort into the most private, intimate spaces of his marriage. The ruling had officially entered his home. Anne's refusal specifically cited the late Queen's protective reserve category, and that phrase landed like a final lock turning in a heavy door. A protective reserve is a highly restricted collection of historical assets set aside under absolute rules, so they can never be used freely for personal display, vanity, or temporary political advantage. This meant that certain sacred items within the vaults could never be used to artificially elevate a household, soften media criticism, or establish dominance in an internal rivalry. Camilla felt the strategic meaning immediately. Charles felt a profound humiliation of being entirely powerless to alter the decision, and, even from a historical distance, had become the immovable barrier that neither of them could bypass or outmaneuver. Prince William quietly received the official copy of the updated access protocol that very same afternoon. A protocol is a strict, unyielding set of steps that every official must follow, and this specific document revealed to the young prince that the future of the reign was already being aligned directly with Anne's custodial philosophy. The Prince of Wales read the text with deep contemplation, fully aware that the court's judgment was not just correcting a minor present dispute. It was actively constructing the framework for what came next. The palace braced itself for immediate strategic retaliation from Camilla's allies, intense domestic pressure from Charles's office, and another devastating collision between the siblings, yet just when internal conflict seemed entirely ready to harden into permanent family resentment, one final private conversation altered the emotional direction of the entire story. The ultimate turning point occurred without the presence of legal advisors, senior courtiers, or polished palace statements. Charles and it met completely alone late in the evening, when the complex machinery of the monarchy had finally gone quiet for the night, leaving only the raw family wound exposed between them. For the very first time since the crisis began, the king stopped focusing entirely on what had been stripped away from his personal authority and began deeply asking what his mother had been trying so hard to protect from the inevitable pressures of time. He did not want another sterile briefing or a cautious sentence prepared by an aide who was terrified of offending his pride. He wanted his sister alone, because the dispute had entirely transcended administrative procedure and had returned to its true origin: shared grief. It was no longer a question of who held the keys to a stone vault, but a profound, aching question of whether his mother had harbored secret doubts about his character at the very end of her life, and came to the meeting fully prepared but completely unarmed, bringing the late Queen's private memorandum with her, but deliberately choosing not to place it between them as a weapon. She knew that if she pushed the document forward too quickly, her brother would see only a cold, post-mortem judgment. So she chose authentic conversation before legal proof, letting the heavy silence settle in the room not as a form of punishment, but as a safe space of things that neither sibling had managed to express while the entire palace watched their every move. Charles finally confessed what his immense royal pride had kept hidden for months. The judicial ruling made him feel as though his mother had judged him failures from beyond the grave. The raw words were simple, but they completely stripped away the grand armor of kingship, revealing a son who had spent his entire life waiting, preparing, and living within the massive shadow of a legendary woman whose ultimate approval still mattered far more to him than any gold crown ever could. And listened intently, and for the very first time since the legal battle began, her legendary structural firmness softened into genuine, deep sorrow for her brother. She looked at him and quietly explained that their mother was never trying to punish his reign. She was desperately trying to protect it. That was a hidden secret resting at the very heart of the entire crisis. The late Queen understood with absolute clarity that the historical vaults would inevitably become dangerous emotional weapons if personal affection, domestic pressure, marital status, or hidden resentments were ever allowed to enter the room. The public crown could easily survive political criticism, but the institution could never survive being dragged into private, petty family rivalries over sacred objects soaked in centuries of national history. And then opened the old memorandum and read one specific private line aloud to the king, reminding him that the vaults were strictly intended to remain entirely above personal affection, domestic pressure, and public display. Charles heard the familiar sentence completely differently this time. It no longer sounded like a cold rejection from a distant mother, but like a profound, protective warning from a visionary sovereign. The historic decision had never been designed by the late queen to weaken his public reign, but to actively keep the integrity of the monarchy from bending beneath the weight of temporary emotional demands, and held the legal power simply because someone within the family had to remain entirely immovable when everyone else was being human. By the following morning, the palace staff had prepared a highly controlled public response, careful, polished, and narrow, hoping to contain the institutional damage. But outside the massive iron gates, the narrative had already escaped into the world. What had originally begun as a highly private royal wound was now a permanent national spectacle, and the public was rapidly choosing its own enduring meaning. The story no longer belonged to the palace. It belonged to people, and as the vaults remained firmly locked under its quiet guard, the monarchy moved forward into the modern era, permanently changed, deeply reminded that even kings must answer to the sacred promises left behind in the silence of history.